I'm a high school principal, and my entire professional life, both as a teacher and as a principal, has been spent in medium to large high schools, schools of between 800 and 1,800 students. For that matter, even as a student, I attended a large high school. And with all that time spent in these large settings, I never really had the occasion to get familiar with very small high schools. Well, that all changed one particular day. On that day, I was returning from a conference with some teachers from my school, and at some point during the car ride, a colleague shared with me that she grew up on Washington Island, Wisconsin, which I knew was a small island on Lake Michigan which could only be reached via car ferry. She shared how she went to school in a very small high school on the island, and that she had a graduating class of only 4 or 5 students total. I found her story interesting, but what really got me thinking was her statement that most, if not all, of these students went on to college after high school and were quite successful. I found this fascinating. Here's a very, very small school, located on a small island, virtually separated from the rest of the world, successfully getting students ready for college. I soon discovered there were other similar schools having similar results. So I wondered, how in the world could such small rural high schools with limited staff, curriculum, and resources possibly get their students ready for success at college? Well, I mentioned that I'm a high school principal, but I'm also a PhD candidate. And as a student, I recognize that good academic research rarely answers questions that start with, how in the world could they possibly? So, with the help of my coursework, my colleagues, and my professors at the University of Wisconsin, I have refined my research question to what strategies, both formal and informal, do small rural public high schools employ that contribute to their students matriculating to and having success in college? This question, of course, is a work in progress. Now, I really wanted to focus my research on what I call micro high schools, or high schools with fewer than 100 students. The reason for this number is that with fewer than 25 students per grade, it's hard to have the staffing and resources available to offer students a wide variety of courses, particularly the advanced level courses that larger high schools tout as being college prep. There are currently over 30 micro high schools in the state of Wisconsin. So why would I include college readiness as a measure in my research? Well, college readiness is fast becoming the standard for high school graduates. In fact, according to the U.S. Department of Labor, almost 90% of the fastest growing high-wage jobs now require post-secondary education. College readiness truly is the standard for schools to aspire to. In addition, researchers and government agencies have argued that the knowledge and skills required to be successful in college are exactly the same as those needed to be successful in entry-level work today. So college readiness seems like an appropriate goal for high schools and a meaningful measure of their success for their students. Now, school-wide college readiness can be somewhat difficult to measure, so in my research I'll be looking at schools who, in relation to like-sized schools and state averages, have solid ACT scores, higher than average ACT participation rates, and report a larger than average percent of their graduates continuing on to post-secondary schooling. This information is available through the state of Wisconsin. To begin my work, I wanted to gain a better understanding of the current body of research as it relates to small, micro, rural high schools and college readiness. Absent of research on this particular topic, I began to broaden my review to include research on the larger domains at play: small school research, rural school research, and research on college readiness, paying particular attention to the intersection of these 3 domains. Now, there's a fair amount of research on high school size, beginning with Conant's 1959 book, in which he argues that in order for high schools to be productive, efficient, and offer meaningful curriculum, they should have at least 1,000 students. Conant even went as far as to say that the small high school was the country's #1 problem at the time, and its elimination should be the top educational priority. You see, this was at the same time that the Soviets began the space race with the launching of the Sputnik satellite. The experts of the time, like Conant, felt that in order for the U.S. to stay competitive, the very structure of the high school had to change. This thinking informed policy, and larger high schools and the consolidation of small high schools, particularly in rural areas, became more and more commonplace. Over the next few decades, researchers discovered flaws in that thinking and discovered that there are some measurable advantages to small high schools. In fact, some even argued that smaller was better. This type of thinking has led to sizable investments into small school initiatives, and while the experts can't seem to agree on what the ideal size is for a high school, I'm interested in discovering how the smallest high schools have remained effective. The majority of the research regarding rural high schools focuses on policy issues, cultural influences, and limited resources. I'm particularly interested in the positive and negative cultural influences at the local level as they relate to college aspirations and readiness for students. In addition, I want to learn about the challenges rural schools face with shrinking resources, such as attracting and retaining high-quality teachers. The final domain focuses on college readiness. There exists a fair body of research regarding college readiness in rural settings, including parental expectations regarding college, the lack of availability of dual enrollment or advanced coursework to students in rural areas, and the limited opportunities for career exposure and college exposure for students in these areas. But again, very little research exists where these three domains intersect, so there's an opportunity to learn how these micro rural high schools do it. Now, in thinking through potential methodological approaches to the study, I can't help but think of the subjects themselves and some of the research that I've read so far. I feel that telling their story through qualitative research approaches seems very informative and fitting in this case. I want to go into the most successful rural micro high schools in Wisconsin and hear their stories on how they're getting students ready for and setting them up for success at college. I want to hear from the teachers, the principals, the students, and the parents. I want to talk to community members and recent graduates who are currently attending college. I want to hear their story firsthand from the source. I want to ask them the question in so many words. How in the world, in a small rural high school, are you successfully getting your kids ready for college? I want to ask, what are the challenges and how do you overcome them? And I want to ask them, what can the rest of the world learn from your high school? I'm guessing there's a lot that we can learn from these small rural micro high schools. So, why study the smallest rural high schools to see how they're getting their students ready for college? Well, many experts agree that college readiness is a standard that all high schools should aspire to. In addition, 10% of all high school students in the U.S. currently attend rural high schools that have 200 or fewer students, and there are plenty of success stories out there that we can learn from. By understanding what the successful rural micro high schools are doing to get their students ready for college, we can use that information to inform practices at other similar schools who are perhaps struggling to achieve the same results. In addition, it's likely that there are lessons to be learned from these successful small high schools that can benefit high schools of all sizes, in all settings, and perhaps all students. That's why I'm doing this research.